So tell me, Margaret, my brother Daniel said loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. How long have you been broke? The words hung in the air like an unpleasant smell, and for a moment the clinking of silverware and the low murmur of conversation around us seemed to fade. We were sitting at a long table near the center of Bellamy's Grill, a polished little restaurant in downtown Hartford where the lighting was soft, the steaks were expensive, and family dinners were supposed to be pleasant. My mother's birthday had brought us all together that night, my cousins, my Aunt Louise, even Daniel's wife Karen, who was already sipping white wine and watching the scene unfold with quiet curiosity. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I folded my napkin slowly and set it beside my plate. Daniel had always liked an audience. When we were kids, he used to tell stories at the dinner table just to make people laugh. But the tone in his voice now wasn't playful. It was sharp, confident, almost triumphant. Come on, he continued, lifting his glass of iced tea. Don't look so surprised. Everyone eventually heard about it. A few heads turned. My cousin Rachel frowned. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Daniel had clearly rehearsed this moment. I could see it in the way he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table as if he were about to deliver important news. Margaret's been having some financial trouble, he announced casually. Real trouble. I heard the bank's about to take the house. The sentence landed with a quiet shock that rippled around the table. Someone whispered. Someone else stopped cutting their steak. I watched their faces carefully. Concern. Curiosity. A little disbelief. It was remarkable how quickly a rumor could reshape a room. Daniel looked pleased with himself, the way a man does when he believes he has just revealed a dramatic secret. I simply picked up my water glass and took a small sip. The truth was, I had been expecting something like this. For the past few months, Daniel had been asking questions, too many questions. Questions about my house, about my late husband's savings, about whether I planned to sell the old property outside town. At first, I had brushed it off as harmless curiosity. Families talk about money. Sometimes. But Daniel's interest had grown more intense, and lately his tone had taken on a strange confidence, as if he believed he knew something the rest of us didn't. You know, he continued, lowering his voice slightly but still loud enough for the entire table to hear, there's no shame in asking for help. If things are that bad, Margaret, you could have just told us. My Aunt Louise gave me a sympathetic look. My mother reached for my hand. The room felt heavy with judgment and pity that I had never asked for. I could see Daniel studying my expression, waiting for embarrassment or anger. Instead, I gave him a small polite smile. Outside the restaurant's tall front windows, the evening traffic moved slowly past the glowing streetlights. Inside, the waiter approached with a tray of fresh drinks for another table. And just as Daniel began to speak again, the front door opened quietly and a tall man in a dark navy suit stepped inside, scanning the dining room as if he were looking for someone. The man paused just inside the doorway as the hostess greeted him, and for a brief second the warm restaurant lights caught the silver threads in his dark hair. I noticed him immediately, although no one else at the table seemed to pay attention yet. Daniel was still speaking, enjoying the quiet tension he had created. You know, he said, tapping the table lightly with one finger. Real estate taxes alone on that old house must be what, $6,000 a year now? Maybe more. I just figured you could not keep up with that forever. My cousin Rachel shifted in her seat. My mother looked confused. I could see the questions forming in their minds, small doubts beginning to grow. Daniel had always been very good at planting those kinds of seeds. He leaned back again, folding his hands as if he had just finished presenting a thoughtful argument. Honestly, Margaret, he continued, lowering his voice in a tone that pretended to be sympathetic, if things are really that tight, you should let family help you out. Pride does not pay the bills. Karen gave a small nod beside him, though she kept her eyes on her wine glass. I noticed that detail too. Karen rarely spoke during these family conversations, but she listened carefully. Across the table, my Aunt Louise cleared her throat. Daniel, maybe this is not the time, she said quietly. We are celebrating your mother's birthday. Daniel shrugged with a casual smile. I am just being honest. The waiter passed behind our table carrying a tray of plates that smelled like grilled salmon and rosemary potatoes. Somewhere near the bar a glass clinked against another. The restaurant was still full of ordinary life, people laughing and talking, completely unaware that my brother had decided to turn this dinner into a public performance. I watched him carefully. Daniel believed he understood the entire story. That confidence showed in every small movement he made. In the relaxed way he rested his arm along the back of his chair, in the satisfied curve of a smile. He thought he had already won. My mother squeezed my hand again. "Margaret," she said gently, "if there is something you need, you can tell us." I gave her a reassuring look. "Everything is fine, Mom." Daniel chuckled softly. "Sure it is." At that exact moment, the man who had entered the restaurant earlier began walking slowly across the dining room. His steps were calm and deliberate, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who is used to important conversations. As he moved between the tables, I could see the polished leather briefcase in his hand and the small gold pin on his lapel. I had seen that pin many times before. Daniel had not noticed him yet. He was too busy watching my face, waiting for me to defend myself or lose my composure. But I remained perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the table. The man stopped a few feet away from us and glanced down at the table with a look of pleasant recognition. His expression brightened immediately. "Well," he said warmly, "Mrs. Collins, I was hoping I might run into you tonight." Daniel's smile faded for the first time that evening. It was subtle, just a small tightening around the corners of his mouth, but I noticed it immediately. The man standing beside our table set his briefcase gently on the empty chair near the aisle and extended his hand toward me with the relaxed confidence of someone greeting a familiar colleague. "Mrs. Collins," he said again with a warm nod, "it is good to see you. I hope I am not interrupting your dinner." I stood and shook his hand. "Not at all, Mr. Whitman. It is a pleasant surprise." Around the table several faces turned toward him with polite curiosity. My mother adjusted her glasses. Rachel leaned slightly forward. Daniel looked from the man to me, trying to place the connection. The man smiled kindly at the table. "I apologize for intruding," he said, "but I just came from the bank and noticed your message earlier today. I thought I would stop by since you mentioned you might be dining here tonight." Daniel blinked once, clearly unsure what he was hearing. "The bank," he repeated slowly. Mr. Whitman nodded. "Yes, Hartford National. I am the branch manager downtown." He said it casually, the way someone might mention their office address, but the words seemed to change the temperature at the table. Karen set her wine glass down. My Aunt Louise raised her eyebrows slightly. I could feel Daniel studying the man more carefully now, his earlier confidence beginning to shift into something less certain. Mr. Whitman turned back to me with a friendly expression. "I reviewed the documents you asked about this afternoon," he said. "Everything looks excellent. Your accounts are in very strong shape." The sentence settled quietly over the table. No one spoke for a moment. Daniel cleared his throat. "Accounts?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Mr. Whitman gave a small polite nod. "Yes, Mrs. Collins has several investment accounts with us. Quite a well-structured portfolio, actually. Very stable long-term positions." My cousin Rachel looked from him to me with a puzzled expression. My mother's hand slowly slipped away from mine as if she was trying to process what she had just heard. Daniel leaned forward again, forcing a laugh that sounded thinner than before. "Well, that is good to hear," he said quickly, "because we were just talking about how things have been a little difficult lately." Mr. Whitman looked genuinely surprised. "Difficult?" he repeated. He glanced at me briefly, then back at Daniel. "I am not sure where you heard that." The room felt very quiet now. Even the background music from the restaurant seemed softer somehow. Mr. Whitman continued speaking in the same calm, professional tone. "In fact, Mrs. Collins and I were discussing the purchase of another commercial property earlier this week. The numbers on that project are very promising." Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around his iced tea glass. I noticed that detail as well. For the first time since the dinner began, he was not smiling. Mr. Whitman lifted his briefcase and opened it partway, glancing at a folder inside before looking back at me. "Actually," he said pleasantly, "I brought the preliminary figures with me in case you wanted to review them tonight." The folder in Mr. Whitman's briefcase made a soft sound as he adjusted it, and although he had not yet taken it out completely, the simple gesture seemed to shift the balance of the entire conversation. Daniel stared at the briefcase, as if it might suddenly explain something he had clearly not expected. I remained calm, resting my hands lightly on the table while the waiter quietly refilled my water glass and stepped away again. Around us, the restaurant continued with its ordinary rhythm, the faint sound of forks against plates, the low hum of conversation, and the distant laughter from another table near the window. But at our table the atmosphere had become very still. Mr. Whitman glanced at me politely. "Of course," he said, "there is no urgency tonight. I simply thought you might appreciate seeing the updated numbers regarding the Riverside commercial building." My cousin Rachel blinked. "Riverside?" she asked softly. Mr. Whitman nodded with a pleasant smile. "Yes, the office complex near Maple Street. Mrs. Collins has been evaluating the acquisition for several weeks now. It is a very promising property, roughly 40,000 square feet of leasable space and located in one of the fastest-growing districts in Hartford." The words seemed to travel slowly around the table as everyone processed them. My mother looked from me to Daniel, clearly confused. Aunt Louise straightened in her chair, curiosity replacing the earlier concern in her expression. Daniel cleared his throat again. "Wait," he said carefully, forcing a small laugh that did not quite reach his eyes. "Are you saying Margaret is buying an office building?" Mr. Whitman answered in the same calm tone he had used since he arrived. "Potentially, yes. We are currently reviewing financing structures, but Mrs. Collins has a very strong position to proceed if she chooses." Daniel's fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the table before he quickly stopped the movement. I noticed the way his posture had changed. The relaxed confidence from earlier had disappeared. Now he sat slightly forward, studying Mr. Whitman as if trying to find a mistake somewhere in the conversation. My mother finally spoke. "Margaret," she said slowly, "I did not realize you were looking at another property." I gave her a gentle smile. "I have been exploring a few opportunities." Mr. Whitman gave a respectful nod. "Your daughter has managed her investments very carefully over the years, Mrs. Collins. In fact, the performance of her portfolio during the past 5 years has been exceptionally stable." Rachel's eyes widened slightly. Karen remained very quiet beside Daniel, but she had stopped sipping her wine and was now watching the exchange with clear interest. Daniel leaned back again, though this time the motion looked forced. "That is interesting," he said, choosing each word carefully. "Because earlier we were discussing how Margaret might be struggling financially." Mr. Whitman looked genuinely puzzled. "Struggling?" he repeated. Then he shook his head politely. "I believe there has been some misunderstanding. Mrs. Collins maintains several well-performing accounts with our institution. Her liquidity alone would easily support the Riverside purchase if she decided to proceed." The table fell silent once more. I could feel the weight of Daniel's gaze now, searching my face for an explanation I had never offered him. Daniel did not speak immediately after that. He simply stared at Mr. Whitman as if the words he had just heard did not quite fit with the version of reality he had been presenting to everyone only minutes earlier. His confidence had been built carefully, sentence by sentence, right there at the dinner table, and now that foundation seemed to be shifting under his feet. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was trying to recover control of the moment. "Well," he said finally, forcing a casual shrug, "that is good news then. Maybe I heard something different." Mr. Whitman closed his briefcase gently and rested one hand on the back of the empty chair beside him. "Financial information can sometimes become distorted when it travels through conversation," he said politely. "But in Mrs. Collins' case, there is absolutely no indication of financial distress." My mother looked directly at me now, confusion mixed with a hint of pride beginning to replace the earlier worry in her expression. "Margaret," she said slowly, "you never told us about all of this." I gave her the same calm smile I had been wearing throughout the evening. There was not really a reason to bring it up. Rachel leaned forward slightly. "But Daniel said the bank might take your house," she said carefully. The table grew quiet again. Daniel shifted in his seat and picked up his iced tea, though he did not drink from it. Instead, he stared down into the glass, as if the melting ice might provide an answer. Mr. Whitman looked mildly surprised by Rachel's comment. "Take the house," he repeated. Then he shook his head with a small, polite smile. "Mrs. Collins owns her property outright. There is no mortgage attached to it at all." Aunt Louise's eyebrows lifted again. My mother slowly turned her head toward Daniel. The room did not feel tense anymore, but it did feel very clear. Like a fog had quietly lifted from the table. Daniel placed the glass back down. "Well," he said quickly, "I guess I misunderstood something someone told me." His voice sounded different now, thinner and less certain than it had been earlier in the evening. I watched him for a moment before speaking. "That happens sometimes," I said calmly. Mr. Whitman glanced at me again with his professional, respectful expression. "Mrs. Collins has actually been one of our most consistent clients for many years," he continued. "Her long-term investment strategy has been very disciplined. Most people would be quite pleased with the stability she has built." Karen finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. "You mean she owns more than just the house?" she asked quietly. Mr. Whitman nodded. "Several properties, actually. Residential and commercial. The Riverside building would simply be the newest addition if she chooses to proceed." My mother leaned back slightly in her chair, still absorbing everything she had heard. Rachel looked at me with open curiosity, now instead of concern. Across the table, Daniel said nothing at all. The story he had confidently introduced earlier had quietly collapsed, piece by piece, without anyone raising their voice or arguing. And the most interesting part was that I had never needed to correct him myself. Daniel remained quiet after that, but the silence around him had changed. Earlier, it had felt like the kind of pause that comes before someone delivers another confident remark. Now it felt different, heavier, like the moment after a door quietly closes. Mr. Whitman adjusted his briefcase and looked toward me again with a friendly professional smile. "I did not mean to interrupt your evening," he said politely. "I simply thought it might be convenient to speak in person since we have been reviewing several options lately." I nodded. "I appreciate that, Harold." Hearing his first name seemed to make the table even quieter. My mother looked at me again, clearly realizing there were parts of my life she had never asked about. "Margaret," she said gently, "how long have you been working with a bank like this?" I thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Almost 12 years now." Rachel blinked. "12 years," she repeated. Mr. Whitman nodded, as if confirming the timeline. "That sounds correct," he said. "Mrs. Collins first came to our office shortly after she sold the manufacturing equipment from her late husband's business. She asked very thoughtful questions about long-term investments." Aunt Louise leaned forward slightly with interest. "You handled all of that yourself?" she asked. I gave a small smile. "Someone had to." Daniel shifted in his chair again. He was not looking at me now. Instead, he stared across the restaurant toward the bar, where a television screen quietly displayed the evening news. I had known Daniel long enough to recognize that posture. When he felt uncomfortable, he avoided eye contact. Mr. Whitman continued speaking in the same calm tone. "Most people underestimate how effective patience can be in financial planning," he said. Mrs. Collins did not rush into anything. She focused on steady growth. Over time, that approach produced very strong results. My mother exhaled slowly, as if something inside her had just settled. "Your father would have been proud of that," she said softly. I felt a quiet warmth at those words, but I did not say much more. The truth was that I had never felt the need to explain these things to anyone. For years, my investments had simply been part of my private routine. I read financial reports in the morning with my coffee. I spoke with Harold every few months about property values or market shifts. None of it had ever seemed dramatic enough to discuss during family dinners. Daniel finally spoke again, though his voice had lost the easy confidence it carried earlier. "So you have been buying properties this whole time?" he asked. I looked at him calmly. Phew. Karen glanced toward him, then back toward me, clearly reconsidering everything she had heard earlier in the evening. Mr. Whitman closed his briefcase and straightened his jacket. "I should not keep you from your dinner any longer," he said politely. Then he looked at me once more with a professional nod. "But before I go, there was one more update about the Riverside building that I wanted to mention." Mr. Whitman rested one hand lightly on the back of the chair, while the rest of the table watched him with growing curiosity. The quiet confidence in his voice had not changed, but now every word seemed to carry more weight than before. Earlier today, he said calmly, we received confirmation from the city planning office regarding the Riverside building. The zoning review was approved this morning. I nodded slightly, because I had already seen the message on my phone that afternoon. Rachel leaned forward again. What does that mean exactly? She asked. Mr. Whitman answered patiently, the way someone explains a business detail without trying to impress anyone. It means the property can legally be converted into mixed commercial space. Offices on the upper floors and retail shops at street level. That change significantly increases the long-term value. Aunt Louise let out a soft breath. That sounds like a big project. It is, Mr. Whitman replied. The building alone covers nearly 40,000 square feet and sits on just over 2 acres of land. With the new zoning approval, the projected value could increase by several $1 million over the next few years. The words seemed to move slowly around the table again. Karen glanced at Daniel, then back toward me, clearly trying to understand how the evening had turned so completely. My mother sat very still now, her earlier confusion slowly transforming into quiet realization. Daniel finally looked at Mr. Whitman again, though his expression had become careful and measured. And Margaret is involved in that? He asked. Mr. Whitman gave a simple nod. Yes. She has been evaluating the purchase with us for some time. Her position allows her to move forward whenever she feels comfortable. Daniel leaned back in his chair again, but this time the movement carried none of the relaxed confidence he had shown earlier in the evening. His eyes shifted briefly toward the tablecloth, then back toward Mr. Whitman as if he was still searching for some explanation that might restore the story he had started earlier. But there was nothing left to question. Everything being said was calm, factual, and completely ordinary to the man who managed my accounts. Mr. Whitman glanced at his watch briefly. I should return to my table, he said politely. But before I go, Mrs. Collins, I wanted to mention that the preliminary financing structure we discussed earlier today has been approved as well. If you decide to proceed with the Riverside acquisition, the bank is fully prepared to support the transaction. Rachel blinked again. You mean the bank would finance the whole thing? She asked. Mr. Whitman smiled politely. A portion of it, yes. Although Mrs. Collins could easily cover a significant amount herself if she wished. The table fell silent once more. The earlier conversation about unpaid taxes and financial trouble now seemed strangely distant, like a story that belonged to someone else entirely. Daniel slowly lifted his glass of iced tea again, but this time he did not speak at all. For the first time that evening, he looked like a man who had just realized he had misunderstood far more than he had ever imagined. Mr. Whitman gave the table one final polite nod before closing his briefcase completely. It was good seeing you again, Mrs. Collins, he said. I will send the full report tomorrow morning. I thanked him quietly and watched as he stepped away from the table, walking back across the restaurant with the same calm, professional pace he had arrived with. For a few seconds after he left, no one spoke. The hum of the restaurant returned slowly, like the sound of a room after a door had been shut. My mother looked at me carefully, still processing everything that had just unfolded. Margaret, she said softly, you never told us you were involved in something that large. I lifted my water glass and took a small sip before answering. It never seemed necessary. Rachel shook her head slightly, half amused and half amazed. Necessary? You have been buying properties and planning office buildings for years, and you thought that was not necessary to mention. I gave a small shrug. I prefer to keep business quiet until decisions are final. Aunt Louise smiled faintly. Your father used to say the same thing. Across the table, Daniel still had not said a word. He stared down at the tablecloth for a moment, then finally cleared his throat. Well, he said slowly, that explains a few things. His voice sounded different now, almost careful, as if he were stepping through unfamiliar ground. Karen glanced toward him, but did not interrupt. I watched Daniel calmly, waiting to see what he would say next. Earlier that evening, he had been completely certain of the story he was telling. He had spoken with confidence, even a little pride, as if he were revealing a hidden truth about me to the rest of the family. Now that certainty had disappeared. I guess, he continued after a moment, I must have misunderstood some things people said. Rachel raised an eyebrow slightly, but said nothing. My mother looked between the two of us, clearly remembering the conversation from earlier in the evening. Daniel shifted again in his chair and picked up his glass of iced tea, taking a long drink before placing it back down. I heard from someone that the bank had been contacting you, he said, trying to sound casual again. I nodded.
They have.
About financing opportunities. The explanation was simple and entirely accurate. For years the bank had contacted me whenever a new commercial property appeared on the market. Daniel seemed to consider that for a moment. Then he let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if it carried any humor. Well, he said, glancing briefly around the table, that certainly turned out different than I expected. The statement hung in the air for a moment. No one argued with it. No one needed to. The truth had already spoken for itself. And the interesting thing was that I had not raised my voice once. I had simply allowed the evening to unfold exactly as it wished. The conversation slowly returned to normal after that, but the tone of the evening had permanently changed. The waiter arrived with fresh plates and quietly asked if anyone needed another drink, and for a moment the table focused on ordinary things again. My mother adjusted the small candle near the center of the table and smiled faintly at me, the kind of smile that carries both surprise and quiet pride. Rachel began asking Aunt Louise about her recent trip to Vermont, and Karen nodded politely as the conversation drifted away from the tension that had filled the room earlier. Daniel, however, remained quieter than usual. He sat with his hands folded loosely in front of him, occasionally glancing in my direction, but never quite meeting my eyes. It was not anger I saw there, and it was not embarrassment exactly. It was something closer to realization. Earlier that evening, he had walked into the restaurant completely certain of the story he wanted to tell about me. He had believed it so strongly that he had shared it confidently in front of the entire family. Now that certainty had dissolved without a single argument, without anyone raising their voice, without a confrontation at all. That was the strange thing about truth. Sometimes it did not need to fight to be heard. It simply arrived and allowed everything else to fall away. My mother lifted her glass and looked at me again. I think your father would have liked the way you handled things tonight, she said gently. I gave her a quiet nod. He taught me most of it. Rachel smiled across the table. Next time you are looking at a new property, she said, you should at least warn us before someone else tells the story first. There was a lightness in her voice now, a subtle shift from concern to admiration. I simply smiled. Across the table, Daniel finally looked up. His expression was calmer now, though still thoughtful. Margaret, he said after a moment, I suppose I should have asked you directly before repeating something I heard. His tone was careful, almost respectful. I considered the words for a moment before answering. That usually works better. He nodded once, accepting the point without argument. The rest of the dinner passed quietly after that. We finished our meals, shared dessert, and wished my mother a happy birthday. Outside the restaurant, the evening air felt cool and clear as we stepped onto the sidewalk under the streetlights. As the family began to head toward their cars, Daniel paused beside me for a moment. You really planned all of that? He asked quietly. I shook my head. No, I said calmly. I simply let the truth arrive when it was ready. Then I wished him a good night and walked toward my car, leaving the restaurant behind as the city lights reflected softly across the quiet street.